Ever feel like you're just swimming in an ocean of information, trying to figure out like what's actually important and what's not?
Yeah.
Well, today we're diving into the world of research
Right?
to give you the essentials of quantitative and qualitative methods.
Yeah, and we'll make sure you understand not just what they are, but like why it even matters.
Exactly.
Especially if we're ever faced with having to interpret research findings on your own.
Exactly.
Which, let's face it, happens more and more these days.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
All right, so let's unpack the fundamentals here. What makes each of these methods tick? First up, quantitative research.
Oh, okay.
So it's all about painting a picture, but with numbers.
It is. Instead of asking someone how they feel about something, you measure it.
Okay.
Like, imagine trying to understand happiness.
Okay.
But instead of asking, you measure how often someone smiles or laughs.
Ah, so you're getting those hard numbers.
Yes.
But why is that so important?
Well, it's all about objectivity. Quantitative researchers, they strive to remain totally neutral.
Okay.
Let the data speak for itself.
Right.
And that's super important because it helps minimize bias, which is when a researcher's own opinions accidentally influence the results.
So it's like, I don't know, you're trying to see if a cake is baked through.
Right.
You wouldn't just eyeball it. You'd use a thermometer
Exact.
to get that accurate read.
A precise, unbiased measurement. And speaking of being precise, quantitative research often starts with a hypothesis.
Okay, hypotheses now, that sounds a little complicated.
Not at all. Think of it like an educated guess, like a detective's hunch at the beginning of a case.
Okay.
Researchers use data to see if their hunch or their hypothesis holds water.
Interesting. Okay, so that's it's all about numbers, objectivity.
Yes.
What about its counterpart, qualitative research?
Mhm.
Our sources describe it as diving into the depths, which to me sounds a lot less about numbers and more about experiences.
It is. It's like exploring a new city. You wouldn't just stick to the tourist maps and the population figures, right?
Right.
You'd wander those side streets, you'd chat with locals, get a feel for the city's vibe.
Right.
That's what qualitative research aims for.
Yeah.
Understanding those rich, nuanced details that numbers alone might miss.
So while quantitative research might tell you what percentage of people dislike a product,
All right.
qualitative research helps you understand why.
Precisely. It goes beyond the what and delves into the why. Imagine you're a business owner and your latest product launch isn't doing as well as you'd hoped.
Okay.
A survey might tell you that a certain percentage of people dislike it.
Okay.
But qualitative research, through interviews or focus groups,
Right.
might uncover that it's the packaging they find unappealing. Or maybe a confusing ad campaign that missed the mark.
So it's like getting the inside scoop, those crucial details that can make all the difference. I like it.
Yeah.
This is making me think about something I've always wondered about research. Like, how do researchers even know where to start? How do they ask the right questions to get those really impactful answers?
That's a great question, and it's actually a key difference between the two approaches we've been talking about.
Okay.
Quantitative research seeks those really concrete answers,
Okay.
often with yes or no or multiple choice questions or by measuring something very specific, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with this product? That kind of thing.
So very structured, very specific.
Exactly.
How does that work with qualitative?
Qualitative is much more open-ended. It's like starting a conversation and seeing where it leads.
Okay.
Instead of saying, how satisfied are you? A qualitative researcher might ask, tell me about your experience with this product.
Okay.
They're looking for those rich narratives, those personal stories that reveal the why behind people's opinions.
It seems like that could lead to some really interesting, unexpected insights.
Absolutely. I remember once I was working on a project about how people were using a new park that had been built.
Okay.
And if we had just sent out surveys asking, do you like the park?
Mm-hmm.
We might have missed out on some really important details.
Yeah.
But because we spent time observing people in the park, having these open-ended conversations with them, we learned that while people generally liked the park,
Okay.
they really wish there were more shaded areas, especially for hot days.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. And that insight directly led to the addition of more trees, awnings, making the park even better.
So even with something like a park that seems pretty straightforward,
Right.
those qualitative insights can be huge.
Absolutely.
Now, our sources also talk about this idea of sampling, which I understand is basically how researchers choose who they're going to study.
It is. It's like a chef tasting their soup. You wouldn't eat the entire pot to know if it needs more salt, right?
No. You'd probably be sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A spoonful is enough to get a sense of the overall flavor. That's what researchers do with sampling. They select a smaller group, a sample, that's representative of the larger group they're interested in.
Okay, that makes sense. But our sources mentioned there can be some pitfalls with sampling, specifically something called sampling biases.
Yeah, sampling bias is a huge consideration for researchers.
Yeah.
It happens when the sample isn't truly representative of the whole group.
Okay.
Imagine if that chef only pasted the broth from the very top of the soup and missed those delicious chunks at the bottom.
Right.
They'd get a very different idea of how the soup actually tastes.
Totally.
Similarly, if a researcher wants to understand, say, the opinions of all voters in a country,
Okay.
but only surveys people in one small town,
Right.
their findings might be totally off.
So it's about making sure that Spoonful is accurately reflecting the entire pot of data.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're going to get some weird results.
Yeah, you risk drawing inaccurate conclusions.
What a fascinating and potentially perilous part of the process.
It really is. It highlights why research needs to be approached so thoughtfully and rigorously.
Absolutely. Okay, so once researchers have figured out their research questions, they've got their sample selected, how do they actually collect the info they need?
That's where those distinct tools we were talking about come into play.
Yeah.
Quantitative researchers, they often use surveys with multiple choice questions.
Right.
To gather data that's easy to analyze statistically. They might also conduct experiments where they can control different factors to isolate cause and effect.
So it's about creating a really controlled environment
Yes.
to get those nice, clean results.
Exactly.
What about on the qualitative side? How do you collect those rich narratives we were talking about?
It's much less about numbers and more about diving deep into those actual experiences.
Okay.
Qualitative researchers might conduct in-depth interviews where they have these long, semi-structured conversations with individuals
Okay.
to explore their perspectives on a topic. Focus groups are another popular method, bringing a small group of people together to discuss their opinions.
Right.
And sometimes, as I mentioned with the park example earlier, the best way to understand something is to simply observe it in its natural environment.
Just watch and see what happens.
Exactly.
So it's about meeting people where they are, whether it's in a conversation, a group setting, or just observing their behavior. It sounds like this stage of the process is super important for both approaches, but they use very different techniques.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about asking the right questions, gathering the data, but what happens next?
Yeah.
Our sources get into this whole analysis phase, and it seems like this is where the real detective work begins.
It really is, and it's completely different depending on what method you've used.
Right.
Quantitative research, it's all about crunching those numbers, right?
Right.
Using statistics to find patterns, look for trends,
Right.
and ultimately figure out if their initial hunch, their hypothesis, was actually correct. So they're searching for clues, but it's in spreadsheets and graphs instead of...
Right. So they've got their magnifying glass out, but instead of looking for fingerprints, they're looking for statistically significant patterns.
Exactly.
I like it. Okay, what about qualitative research? How do you analyze something like an interview or a transcript?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because instead of numbers,
Okay.
qualitative researchers, they're looking for themes, patterns, connections within words,
Okay.
images, even videos.
Interesting.
So imagine reading through pages and pages of interview transcripts, highlighting key phrases, grouping similar responses together. It's like piecing together a puzzle, you know,
Right.
looking for those aha moments where a deeper understanding emerges.
So both paths, you're trying to find those aha moment, those answers to the research questions you started with,
Right.
but you're using very, very different tools to get there.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding the answers, right? It's about communicating them effectively. Both quantitative and qualitative researchers, they need to connect their findings back to that original research question.
Okay.
Explain not just what they discovered, but why it matters.
Right. So it's like closing the loop, showing why that whole research journey was important.
Exactly.
Our sources wrap up by talking about how important it is to actually share those research findings.
It's crucial.
And it makes me think about, as podcasters, we're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Present information clearly, engagingly.
Sure.
And it seems like researchers have that same task.
Absolutely. A well-written research paper, it's like a well-produced podcast. They should both be accessible, engaging, thought-provoking.
Right.
And just as we strive for accuracy, balance in our episodes,
Right.
researchers have really rigorous methods to make sure that their work is credible One crucial part of that is something called peer review.
I've heard of peer review. What does that actually mean?
It's essentially a quality control system for research. So
Right.
before a study is published, other experts in the field, they review it, scrutinize the methods, the analysis, the conclusions.
Right.
It helps ensure that the research is sound and unbiased before it's shared with the world.
It's so fascinating to get this peek behind the curtain of how research is conducted, how it's
Yeah.
analyzed, how it's shared.
Yeah, it's a whole process.
We've really journeyed through these two very distinct worlds of quantitative and qualitative research.
We have.
But we've shown how they're both essential for understanding our complex world.
Absolutely different sides of the same coin in a way.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has even sparked a research question or two for you out there listening.
That would be amazing.
What are you curious about now? What stands out to you? Keep those metal gears turning because that's what this is all about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of research.